There is something happening right now in hundreds of laboratories and on at least one space station overhead that nobody talks about the way it deserves to be talked about. Not in the way you talk about something that keeps returning to you at odd hours, while you're washing a dish, while you're waiting for something to finish. The fact that bone, which most of us imagine as the fixed part of ourselves, the permanent armature underneath everything else, is actually doing something, continuously, without asking permission. Bone is being made and unmade right now, while you are lying here. It is not the solid thing it looks like in diagrams. Welcome back to the sleepy biologist. If you're new, I'm glad you found this. If you've been here before, I'm glad you came back. Tonight we're going somewhere that took me a long time to understand, or maybe to feel correctly. Not the distance of space, not yet. Just the body. What happens to it when you remove the one thing it was built around? The skeleton has been arguing with gravity for as long as there have been skeletons. That's not a loose way of saying it. It's close to the literal mechanism. Bones remodeled themselves in response to mechanical load, the pressure of walking, of carrying, of simply standing inside a gravitational field and refusing to collapse. Cells called osteoclasts dissolve old bone. Cells called osteoblasts deposit new bone. They work in a balance that is not peaceful so much as active, like two people agreeing not to let a conversation die. And the whole negotiation is governed in part by the signal of weight. By stress moving through structure, remove the weight, send the body somewhere weight does not reach. What happens is quiet. That is the part that stays with me. There is no alarm, no signal the body sends to itself to say something has changed. Something is wrong, prepare. The osteoclasts continue dissolving, the osteoblasts slow. The balance tips, not dramatically, but consistently the way a scale tips when you remove one small thing from it every day for months. Astronauts on long missions can lose 1 to 2% of bone mass per month in the weight-bearing regions, the spine, the hips, the femur. Some of that loss takes years to recover. Some of it, in certain studies, appears not to fully recover at all. A small cold fact just sitting there. The part that is strange to sit with, and I mean this genuinely not as a rhetorical move, is that the body is not making an error. It is doing exactly what it was built to do. When load disappears, bone mass becomes metabolically expensive to maintain without apparent purpose. The body, being relentlessly practical in ways the conscious mind rarely is, begins to economize. It is not neglect. It is efficiency applied in a context the body has no way of understanding, because the body has no category for space. It has never needed one. 4 billion years of life on this planet, and nothing in the deep machinery of the skeleton has ever had to ask, what if there is no ground? There's something almost innocent about that. Osteocalcin, one of the proteins bone cells produce, has been found to do other things in the body. It crosses into the brain. It seems to influence memory. This is newer research, still being understood, still being argued about in the careful way scientists argue. But it means bone is not inert scaffolding, even by the most generous definition. It is in conversation with systems you would not expect. And in microgravity, that conversation changes register without anyone noticing until months later, when a scan reveals a density that used to be higher. The bones of the hand seem relatively spared. The skull mostly. It is the bones that were holding you upright that soften, the ones that were under the most load. Which means there is a logic to it, even now, even in the dissolution. The body is letting go of exactly what it no longer needs to hold. That is the part I keep returning to, not the loss itself, but the precision of it. The sleep of the skeleton. Somewhere overhead tonight, inside a pressurized module no larger than a modest apartment, someone's femur is doing this. Quietly. Without urgency. Below you, meanwhile, the ground is pressing back against your weight, and your bones are receiving that signal and responding to it, and none of it requires your attention or your awareness, and that has been true every night of your life. Tomorrow there are other systems, other conversations the body is having with a universe it did not evolve inside. Your cardiovascular system has been solving a problem all day that you have not thought about once. The problem is this: blood is heavy and the heart is not at the top of the body. Every time the heart contracts, it has to push blood upward, to the brain, to the shoulders, against the consistent downward pull of a planet that would prefer everything to settle at the lowest available point. The vessels that carry blood upward have small valves in them to prevent backflow. The muscles in the legs compress the veins as they contract, helping push blood back toward the heart. The arterioles, tiny vessels that regulate flow into capillary beds, adjust their diameter constantly, raising or lowering resistance to maintain pressure within a narrow viable range. All of this is happening right now, has been happening since you woke up, will happen while you sleep at a slower rate. The whole cardiovascular architecture modulating quietly through the night to keep fluid where it needs to be, inside a body that is always, insistently being pulled downward. In microgravity, the pull disappears, and the blood, which had been spending its entire existence fighting upward, suddenly doesn't need to fight. It redistributes. Not all at once, not dramatically, but within hours of reaching orbit, the fluid that gravity had been pooling in the lower body begins to migrate toward the chest and head. Astronauts describe a feeling of fullness in the face, a stuffiness not unlike a head cold, a sense of pressure that sits behind the eyes and across the sinuses. Their faces actually puff, visibly, in photographs taken in the first days on orbit. The legs, meanwhile, begin to thin. Bird legs, astronauts call them. The phrase is their own. The legs thin because the fluid that used to pool there under gravity is no longer pooling there. The fullness moves upward, and the lower limbs, freed from the fluid volume they normally carry, look narrower. Slightly strange. Not unhealthy exactly. Just wrong in the specific way that a face looks wrong in a mirror that is slightly the wrong shape, recognizable but off. The heart, receiving all this extra fluid in the chest, does what the heart is built to do when it detects excess volume. It reads abundance. Stretch receptors in the atrial walls, small mechanosensitive structures that measure the degree to which the heart's chambers are filling, fire more strongly. The signal travels. The kidneys receive instruction to excrete more fluid. Hormones that normally conserve blood volume, antidiuretic hormone, aldosterone, are suppressed. The body begins, efficiently and without hesitation, to reduce its total blood volume. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do. The design just doesn't account for this. Over the first days and weeks in orbit, blood plasma volume can drop by 10 to 15%. The body, having decided it had too much fluid, has let some of it go, and for a while this feels like a solution. The cardiovascular system settles into a new equilibrium. The heart adjusts its output to the reduced volume. The circulation continues. Astronauts stop noticing the facial puffiness after a few days because the excess fluid has been excreted and the system has found a new balance point. The problem arrives on the way home. The reduced blood volume that made sense in microgravity is inadequate back in a gravitational field. The heart, returning to a world where blood must fight upward again, is working with less fluid than it needs. The vessels, which had adjusted to lower pressures, cannot immediately compensate. Standing up produces a drop in blood pressure that the body cannot quickly correct. The brain receives less blood than it needs, and the astronaut feels it as lightheadedness, as a greying at the edges of vision, as the specific vertiginous wrongness of a body that has lost its calibration. The heart was not wrong exactly. It was reading the situation it was in. The fluid signals it received were real. The hormonal response it triggered was proportionate and appropriate and correct for the information available. It simply had no way of knowing that the information had changed, that the abundance it detected was not abundance at all, but the ordinary fluid volume of a body in a gravitational field, suddenly freed from the field that had been pooling that fluid in the legs for an entire lifetime. The heart was solving last year's problem, which is, in a certain light, something recognizable. The application of a reliable rule to a situation the rule was never tested against. The confident misreading, the body writing equations for conditions it no longer inhabits, carrying the solutions into a world that has moved on. The cardiovascular system will recalibrate. It always does. But for weeks after return, the body remembers the wrong answer, holds it in its vessel walls and hormone levels and heart rate responses, and has to be gently, systematically reminded of what the ground actually requires. Tonight the blood is doing what it has always done, moving, adjusting, fighting the quiet, constant pull of the planet you are lying on, keeping the pressure where it needs to be, keeping the brain fed, keeping everything in the careful equilibrium that you will not notice until morning, because it never asks you to. The heart knows where it is. For now, it knows exactly where it is. It started with astronauts reporting that they couldn't read things clearly after returning. Not dramatically, not blindness, not darkness. Just fine print slightly beyond reach. The kind of thing you might blame on fatigue, on age, on the particular dimness of whatever room you were standing in. Some of them had been away for 6 months. A few had been away longer, and when the imaging came back, the optic nerve was swollen. The eyeball, in some cases, had changed shape. Not by much, but measurably. And that word, measurably, is doing a lot of work in this story. The condition has a name now. Spaceflight Associated Neuroocular Syndrome, SANS, which is a very clean acronym for something that is not clean at all. For a while nobody knew what was causing it. That's worth sitting with. These are some of the most monitored human beings on Earth, or rather off it, and still, the mechanism was not immediately obvious, which says something maybe about how many things the body does in microgravity that we simply hadn't predicted. How many assumptions were built into our models without us knowing they were assumptions? The answer, when researchers started to find it, involved cerebrospinal fluid. The brain's own cushioning, sabouage, a clear liquid that flows continuously through the spaces around the brain and spinal cord, absorbing shock, removing waste, keeping intracranial pressure within a narrow livable band. On Earth, gravity pulls some of that fluid downward. Not all of it, but enough. Enough that the system drains and circulates the way it was built to. Remove gravity, and the fluid redistributes. It shifts toward the head, it accumulates. And pressure, which was previously kept in careful equilibrium, begins to rise. Not sharply, not enough to feel, but enough to press. Gently, persistently, against the back of the eye. That's all it takes. The optic nerve sits in a sheath filled with cerebrospinal fluid. On Earth, that sheath is pressurized at a level the nerve has evolved to tolerate. In microgravity, that pressure becomes slightly chronically higher, and over months the nerve swells. In some astronauts, the back of the eyeball flattens, the retina folds slightly. The whole focal geometry of vision shifts in a way that glasses cannot fully correct, because the problem is not in the lens. There is something specifically unsettling about this. I find it hard to locate the exact source of the unsettlement. Maybe it is that the fluid doing this was not invading. It was already there. It belongs there, the body made it and uses it and cannot function without it. And yet, under new conditions, it became the thing pressing against the window of sight. The cushion became the pressure, the brain protecting itself, the eye paying for it. In some astronauts, the changes partially resolve after return. In others, they persist. The data is still accumulating. There are researchers who think that certain anatomical features, the size of the optic nerve sheath, the dimensions of particular channels through which fluid drains, may make some people more vulnerable than others, that some bodies are simply built in a way that manages this redistribution better. Which means we may be approaching a future where, before a long mission, someone looks carefully at the specific geometry of your skull and decides whether your optic nerve can survive the journey. That is a strange sentence to say out loud. Somewhere in all of this is a question that probably has no clean answer. What does the eye do when it can no longer trust its own shape? The photoreceptors still fire. Light still lands on the retina. The signal still travels through the optic nerve and into the visual cortex, still gets processed and interpreted and turned into something recognizable. But the translation is off. A hair. And a hair over long distances matters. I read somewhere, I can't remember where, some paper or maybe a summary of one, that some astronauts described the visual changes as subtle enough that they didn't notice them until they tried to do something precise. Reading a label, identifying a small instrument. The ordinary granularity of daily life suddenly requiring more effort, which is not how you want to discover that your eye has changed shape. The fluid is still there, by the way. When they come home, it redistributes again, downward, back into the old geometry, the pressure eases, slowly, and for some astronauts, slowly the vision stabilizes. The nerve swelling reduces. The eye finds something close to what it was. Though close is not the same word as same, there are still things we don't know about why SANS affects some crew members severely and others barely at all. There are still questions about whether shorter missions produce measurable subclinical changes that never get noticed. There are still hypotheses being tested about countermeasures, pressure suits for the lower body that might encourage fluid to stay further from the head, negative pressure devices, different sleep orientations, none of them fully proven, all of them suggesting that this is a problem the body does not solve on its own. Outside this, out in deep space beyond the magnetosphere, there is radiation to consider, its own relationship with the eye, its own strange signatures, but that is a different kind of pressure, a different kind of arrival. Muscle needs an argument to stay, not struggle exactly, not pain, just the ordinary daily fact of resistance, of gravity, of load, of a body asking something of itself, and the muscle responding. That transaction, happening thousands of times a day in ways you never feel as individual events, is what tells muscle tissue to remain, to maintain its protein architecture, to keep the structure built. Remove the argument, watch what the muscle does, it begins to dismantle, not all at once, not visibly in the first days, but the cells are already measuring the absence of load, already recalibrating what is necessary, and they are practical in the way all cellular processes are practical, without sentiment, without hesitation, without any interest in what the muscle used to do or what it might be needed for later. Myosin and actin, the proteins that give muscle its contractile structure, begin to be broken down faster than they are replaced. The architecture does not collapse. It is quietly, methodically reduced, the way a building might be carefully unbolted rather than demolished. Astronauts can lose close to 20% of muscle mass over a 6-month mission without aggressive countermeasures. The legs mostly, the postural muscles, the ones that were always working, that never fully rested even when you thought you were resting, have spent your entire life holding you upright inside a gravitational field. Those muscles lose the most because they had the most to lose. They were the ones the Earth needed most from you. In space, they are simply not needed. That sentence has no drama in it. It is just a fact, and the body treats it as a fact. Exercise on the International Space Station is not optional. 2 hours a day, sometimes more. Resistance training, cycling, treadmill running, with bungee cords pulling the astronaut toward the surface of a treadmill instead of gravity doing it. It is elaborate and effortful, and it only partially works. Muscle mass is preserved better than it used to be. But the losses still occur. The body still economizes, still finds ways to become incrementally a little less than what it was on the ground. There is a word for severe muscle loss, sarcopenia. It happens in aging, in prolonged illness, in long immobility. Space compresses the timeline. What takes years on Earth can begin in weeks in orbit. The mechanisms are similar enough that researchers studying spaceflight muscle loss and researchers studying aging sometimes find themselves reading each other's papers with a particular attention. This is not a coincidence. The body apparently has only so many ways to let something go. Coming back is harder than going. The cardiovascular system is compromised. The bones have softened, and the muscles that were meant to carry the body through a gravitational field have been quietly reducing themselves for months, and now the field is back, and the muscles are not what they were, and the body has to rebuild from where it currently is, which it does, slowly. Given enough time, enough load, enough argument, the muscle responds, the proteins reassemble, the architecture returns. not always to its prior state, not always completely, but close enough that after months of rehabilitation, most astronauts walk normally again, run again, carry things. The body remembers effort, even after it has forgotten how to need it. Close your eyes for a moment and tilt your head slightly to one side. You felt that, not just as movement, as information. Something in the inner ear registered the shift, sent a signal upward, and your brain updated its model of where you are in space. You didn't decide to feel it. You didn't process it consciously. It simply arrived, the way most of the body's information arrives, already interpreted, already filed, already converted into something usable before awareness even enters the picture. That system has been running since before you were born, since before your ancestors were your ancestors, really. The vestibular apparatus, two small fluid-filled structures in the inner ear, lined with hair cells that bend in response to motion and gravity, is among the older pieces of sensory equipment the vertebrate body carries. It evolved in fish. It has been refined across hundreds of millions of years into something extraordinarily precise. On Earth, in microgravity, it is extraordinarily wrong. The first days in space are for many astronauts deeply unpleasant in a specific and hard-to-describe way. Space adaptation syndrome it's called, which is a polite name for what amounts to the brain receiving a stream of sensory information it cannot reconcile. The vestibular system keeps reporting. The fluid in the semicircular canals keeps moving. The otolith organs, small calcium carbonate crystals resting on beds of hair cells, normally dragged by gravity in ways that signal orientation, suddenly have no gravity to drag them. They send signals. The brain expects those signals to mean something they no longer mean. Meanwhile, the eyes are reporting something different. The body is floating. There is no clear down. What the brain does with this disagreement is try to resolve it. For a few days it tries very hard. It cycles through interpretations, checks and rechecks, finds no stable answer, and the result of that cycling, the nausea, the disorientation, the strange swimmy quality that astronauts describe in interviews when they're trying to explain what arrival in space actually felt like, is not weakness. It is a sophisticated system doing exactly what it was built to do, applied to a situation it was never built for. I think about this sometimes when I'm in a car reading something and my stomach starts to turn. A much smaller version of the same disagreement, eyes saying stationary, vestibular system saying moving. The brain tries to reconcile, fails, registers something like alarm in the stomach, and I'm only in a car, only for a few minutes. The astronaut is in that disagreement for days, in a pressurized capsule hurtling at 8 kilometers per second with no fixed reference for up or down, and the calcium crystals in their inner ear are drifting uselessly and the brain is still trying to find the ground. Then the brain stops trying. Not immediately, not cleanly, but gradually over several days, a process of sensory reweighting occurs. The brain, unable to extract reliable orientation data from the vestibular system, begins to prioritize vision. The eyes become the dominant spatial sense. The inner ear is not ignored exactly, it is demoted. Its vote counts for less. And the brain, working with this new hierarchy, constructs a functional model of orientation based primarily on what the eyes can see, which way the workstation is, which way the hatch opens where other people's feet are pointing. Up becomes a social agreement, or perhaps a chosen one. Some astronauts report that they would approach a module from one direction and feel completely oriented, and then rotate to another wall and feel briefly like the room had flipped. The old system's still flickering, still sending signals the brain now mostly ignores. There is something, I notice I want to call it lonely, which is probably my projection, in the idea of a sensory system that spent your entire life being authoritative, suddenly finding itself sidelined by a brain that has decided it cannot be trusted. The nausea fades. The disorientation fades. Astronauts on long missions describe eventually feeling entirely comfortable in microgravity, moving through the station with ease, orienting effortlessly, sleeping without any sense that their body doesn't know which way it's facing. The adaptation is real, and it is thorough. And then they come home. The re-entry is its own problem. The vestibular system, which spent 6 months being ignored, is suddenly back in a world where it works correctly. But the brain has spent 6 months learning not to trust it. The recalibration runs in reverse, slowly. And in the meantime, returning astronauts report the walls seeming to tilt, the ground feeling strange beneath them, a difficulty with balance that can last weeks. Some describe the particular strangeness of lying down and feeling incorrectly but insistently that they are falling. The brain built a model for a world without weight. Now it has to remember what weight means, not relearn, remember, which is a different kind of work. Not construction but retrieval, reaching back through 6 months of override for something that was always there underneath, waiting for the conditions to return. And slowly it does return. The inner ear and the brain find each other again. The ground becomes trustworthy again. Up stops being a decision. Most nights you don't notice any of this. The system runs. The otoliths settle in their fluid. The hair cells bend. The brain receives its orientation report and files it without comment, and you turn over in your sleep without waking, without wondering where you are, without having to think at all about which way is down. It is a small and perfect thing, that knowledge. There is a kind of radiation that does not come from the sun. It comes from somewhere further, from the deaths of stars in other parts of the galaxy, from shock waves produced when massive stellar objects collapse, from processes so energetic and so distant that the particles they release travel for millions of years before arriving anywhere. They arrive here too, at Earth constantly, in enormous numbers. But Earth has a magnetosphere, a vast invisible architecture of field lines generated by the churning iron in its core, and most of these particles are deflected, caught, redirected toward the poles, where they spiral down field lines and collide with atmosphere and produce light. The aurora is, among other things, the visible record of the planet absorbing what space keeps throwing at it. You are inside that protection right now. The particles that do reach sea level are mostly secondary. The original cosmic ray has already collided with an atom in the upper atmosphere, and what reaches you is a cascade of lower energy products. You receive roughly 2 to 3 millisieverts of radiation per year, just from background sources, cosmic and terrestrial combined. It is not zero. It has never been zero. Life evolved inside a radiation field, low but persistent, and the body has repair mechanisms that handle a certain amount of DNA, damage as routine, not damage as problem, damage as expected, damage as managed. Leave the magnetosphere, the number changes. On the surface of Mars, with no magnetosphere and an atmosphere roughly 1% as thick as Earth's, the radiation dose would be approximately 300 millisieverts per year from cosmic rays alone. On a transit through deep space, unshielded, the figure is higher. Aboard the International Space Station, still within the partial protection of Earth's magnetosphere, astronauts receive doses 10 times higher than people on the ground. Beyond it, in the space between planets, where the solar wind itself becomes unreliable and the galactic field opens in all directions, the body is exposed in a way that has no precedent in the evolutionary history of anything that has ever lived. Galactic cosmic rays are the specific problem, not solar radiation, which is energetic but blockable, aluminum, water mass between you and the source. Galactic cosmic rays are different. They are protons and heavier atomic nuclei accelerated to velocities approaching the speed of light, and they carry so much energy that conventional shielding does not stop them. It slows them. Sometimes shielding makes it worse. A cosmic ray hitting a thick metal wall can produce secondary particles, a spray of radiation that is in some configurations more damaging than the original. The particle passes through the wall, through the suit, through you, not around, through. I want to be careful here because this is the point where the body becomes, in a certain light, something other than a body. A cosmic ray passing through human tissue is not like a bullet. It doesn't destroy a path of cells, doesn't leave a visible wound. It ionizes as it travels. It strips electrons from atoms along its trajectory, and those freed electrons can damage nearby molecules, including, occasionally, the DNA inside a cell nucleus. The cell may repair the damage correctly, it usually does, or it may repair it imperfectly, introducing a mutation that sits dormant for years, or it may not repair it at all. The outcomes are probabilistic. The particle does not know what it hit. One of the stranger documented experiences of spaceflight, and I find myself returning to this detail with a persistence I can't fully explain, is that astronauts, in the dark with eyes closed, sometimes see flashes of light. Brief, sporadic, not quite like anything in ordinary visual experience. Apollo astronauts reported them. Shuttle astronauts reported them. ISS crew members have reported them. The leading explanation is that cosmic rays and high-energy protons are passing through the eyeball and interacting directly with the retina, Cherenkov radiation, or direct ionization of the photoreceptors themselves, producing a signal the visual cortex interprets as light, the eye seeing what the eye was not built to see. A particle that travelled possibly for millions of years through interstellar space, originating in the collapse of a star that no longer exists, arriving at this precise location in the solar system at this precise moment, passing through a sealed spacecraft, through an eyelid, through the vitreous humour, striking a single rod or cone cell in the retina of a sleeping astronaut. And the astronaut sees a flash of light. I don't have a way to make that smaller than it is. The long-term concern is cancer risk. This is not speculative. Radiation causes DNA damage. DNA damage can initiate malignancy. High radiation environments increase that probability. NASA has for decades maintained career radiation exposure limits for astronauts, limits calculated to keep excess lifetime cancer risk below a certain percentage. Those limits have been difficult to set with confidence because the data on high-energy particle radiation in humans is genuinely limited. We have atomic bomb survivor data, we have radon exposure studies, we have occupational radiation worker data. We do not have a large cohort of humans who spend years in deep space and lived long enough to track their cancer outcomes, because no such cohort exists yet. The data is still being assembled, lying here, inside a building, under several miles of atmosphere. There is something almost, I notice it, the thought arriving sideways, something almost aquatic about it. The way water pressure protects things that live deep enough. The way the atmosphere sits above you right now, all of it, tons per square inch at sea level, the full column of air pressing down, and within that column, the field lines of the magnetosphere curving overhead, redirecting, absorbing, holding the worst of it back. Not perfectly, not completely, just enough. What enough will mean for bodies travelling beyond it is a question that remains genuinely open. The physics is understood, the biology is not. The interaction between high LET radiation, the heavy, fast particles that cause clustered DNA damage, and living tissue over years and decades is still being modelled, still being debated, still producing papers that do not quite agree with each other on the size of the risk. The body may be more resilient than the models suggest, or less. There are other things in deep space, other conditions the body has no template for. The radiation is only the one that passes through you without asking. Every 90 minutes, the International Space Station crosses a sunrise. Not a slow one. Not the kind that takes half an hour and moves through orange into gold before the day actually begins. A sharp one. Darkness. Then light. Then darkness again. 16 times in every 24 hours. The sun appearing and disappearing at a rate the body has no category for. And the body, which has spent its entire existence calibrated to one sunrise per day, does not know what to do with 16. It does not panic. It does not adapt. It simply loses its footing. The circadian system is old. Not old in the way that most things we call old are old, not decades, not centuries. The molecular clock embedded in living cells appears in organisms going back over 3 billion years. Cyanobacteria have circadian rhythms. Fungi have them. The basic mechanism, a set of proteins that interact in a feedback loop, inhibiting their own production in a cycle that runs close to 24 hours, was so useful, so precisely matched to the rotation speed of this particular planet, that evolution kept it, refined it, and embedded it not in one central location but everywhere. In your liver, in your skin, in your heart muscle. Every cell in the body carries a version of the clock. Every cell is, among other things, a timepiece. And every timepiece needs a signal to stay synchronized. On Earth, that signal is light. Specifically, short-wavelength blue light landing on photosensitive cells in the retina. Not the rods and cones involved in vision, but a separate population of cells whose only job is to tell the brain what time it is. They send their signal to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, a small paired structure in the hypothalamus, which distributes time information to the rest of the body. This is why morning light wakes you more effectively than an alarm. This is why screens at night delay sleep. The light is wrong for the hour, and the cells in the retina cannot distinguish artificial blue from dawn. The astronaut in orbit receives neither consistent darkness nor consistent light. 16 sunsets, 16 sunrises. The retinal cells keep firing. The suprachiasmatic nucleus keeps receiving signals, but the signals arrive too fast, too often, at intervals that match nothing in the clock's evolutionary memory. The rhythm begins to drift. Melatonin, released by the pineal gland in darkness, suppressed by light, has no reliable darkness to respond to. Cortisol, which normally surges before waking to prepare the body for the day, loses its sharp morning peak and spreads itself unevenly across the hours. Core body temperature, which cycles through a low in the early morning and a high in the late afternoon, flattens. The peaks and valleys that normally organize the body's day, alertness, digestion, immune activity, cellular repair, soften into something more continuous and less useful. I think about night shifts sometimes. The specific flatness of being awake at 3 a.m. when the body insists it should not be. The way the world looks slightly wrong, the way even hunger doesn't feel normal. A far smaller version. A disruption measured in hours rather than months. Still enough to feel it plainly in the quality of thought, the heaviness of the hands. On orbit, this persists. Sleep medication is among the most commonly used substances on the International Space Station. That sentence does not require elaboration. The body eventually finds something close to a rhythm, or rather, astronauts impose one, using blue light blocking goggles before sleep periods, carefully timed light exposure, structured schedules maintained with deliberate rigidity. It helps. It does not fully solve it. The underlying problem remains. The environment is not doing what the body expects an environment to do, and the body, which cannot change what the environment is doing, adjusts its expectations imperfectly and continues. Sleep on orbit is shorter on average, less efficient by most measures. The deep, slow-wave phases, during which the glymphatic system clears metabolic waste from the brain, are often reduced. The body is resting but not quite restoring, alert but not quite sharp. A clock still running, just reading the wrong time. Right now the light outside has been fading or has already faded, or will begin to fade in the hours you're moving through, and something in your retina has already registered it, already sent its signal forward, already begun the slow preparation. Melatonin rising, core temperature beginning its long nightly descent. The body doing what it has always done when this particular planet turns away from the sun. You don't have to think about it. That's the part worth noticing, maybe, before the thinking stops, that the body is already ahead of you, already counting down to sleep in the only language it has ever known, which is light, and the slow, reliable disappearance of it. The body has been carrying certain viruses for years, not actively, not in any way that produces symptoms or demands attention. They arrived at some point, childhood, usually, or early adulthood, replicated briefly, were met by the immune response and retreated. Into nerve tissue mostly, into certain long-lived immune cells. They did not leave. They compressed themselves into a kind of biological dormancy, their genetic material present but largely held in check by a surveillance system that checks in on them continuously and keeps them from reactivating. Most people carry several of these: herpes simplex, Epstein-Barr, varicella zoster, the virus responsible for chickenpox, which then persists in the dorsal root ganglia for the rest of a person's life, occasionally reactivating as shingles when the immune system is sufficiently stressed or aged. You carry some of these probably. They are not doing anything right now. In space, they begin to stir. Studies of astronauts before, during, and after missions have found that latent herpes viruses reactivate at higher rates in orbit. Not in everyone, not always symptomatically, but the viral shedding, detectable in saliva and urine, increases. The viruses are doing something the immune system would normally prevent them from doing. They are moving, testing the boundaries of the containment. And the containment, for reasons that are still not fully resolved, is holding less firmly than it does on the ground. This is the chapter's centre, I think. Not the reactivation itself, but what it reveals. That the immune system's ability to maintain these long-standing negotiations is sensitive to conditions that seem, on the surface, unrelated to virology. Radiation exposure damages DNA in immune cells the same way it damages DNA in any cell. Disrupted sleep reduces the production of cytokines, the signaling molecules that coordinate immune responses. The physiological stress of microgravity, the fluid shifts, the bone and muscle changes, the constant low-grade demand on the body to adapt, produces a hormonal environment that modulates immune function in ways still being characterized. None of these is an immune problem specifically. All of them arrive at the immune system anyway. T cells, which are among the immune system's most sophisticated instruments, capable of recognizing specific molecular signatures on the surface of infected or malignant cells, of remembering past encounters, of coordinating the responses of other immune cells, become less responsive in microgravity. In laboratory studies, T cells cultured in simulated microgravity proliferate less vigorously when stimulated. They are slower to activate. Something in the mechanical environment that cells normally inhabit, something about the way cytoskeletal structures respond to gravity at the microscopic level, appears to matter for T cell function in ways researchers are still trying to understand. The immune system evolved in a gravitational field. That is easy to say and hard to fully absorb, not just in an environment with gravity, inside a body that was built by and for gravity, whose cells were shaped over hundreds of millions of years by the constant downward pressure of a planet pulling on everything, including the fluid dynamics inside individual cells, including the way cell membranes settle and distribute their proteins, including the mechanical signals that pass through the cytoskeleton when a cell is physically stressed or compressed or pulled. Gravity is not just a backdrop to biology, it is woven into the operating conditions of the cell. Remove it, see what changes. The changes are not catastrophic. This is worth saying carefully. Astronauts do not return from missions immunologically devastated. They do not routinely develop serious infections in orbit. The system continues to function. It is, by any reasonable measure, still doing most of what it is supposed to do, but the margins shift. The latent viruses test their boundaries. The T cells activate more slowly. The cytokine profiles look different from what they look like on the ground. Something is off, slightly, in the way that a clock can be off slightly, still telling the time, still useful, just drifting. There is a particular detail from the research that I find myself thinking about at odd moments, while I'm waiting for water to boil, once while I was on a train watching the lights outside go past, which is that natural killer cells, the immune system's rapid response units, have been found to show altered cytotoxicity in microgravity. Natural killer cells don't need prior exposure to a target to recognize and destroy it. They are the immune system's oldest surveillance mechanism, predating the adaptive immune response, acting on pattern recognition rather than learned memory. And in microgravity, their killing efficiency changes, something that ancient, still subject to the conditions of the environment. What the immune system is doing in space is not failing. It is trying to run a program in an environment the program was not written for. The surveillance continues, the signaling continues, the memory of past pathogens persists, but the efficiency is degraded, subtly, across multiple arms of the system simultaneously, and the cumulative effect of those small degradations is what allows a virus that has been silent for a decade to begin, quietly, to move. The body negotiated a truce with these viruses a long time ago. The truce holds mostly, but the terms are being strained. What the immune system cannot know, has no way of knowing, is that the conditions straining those terms are temporary, that in months the body will return to a gravitational field, to regular light cycles, to the radiation levels the system evolved inside, that the T cells will recover their responsiveness, that the viral shedding will decrease, that the ancient surveillance will tighten again. The immune system cannot plan for a return it doesn't know is coming. It only knows that something, in the conditions surrounding it, is not what it was built for. And it continues anyway, vigilant, imperfect, ancient, trying. Time passes at different rates in different parts of the universe. This is not a metaphor. It is not a way of saying that time feels different depending on circumstances, or that certain experiences seem to stretch or compress subjectively. It is a description of physical reality, verified by atomic clocks, confirmed by GPS satellites that require relativistic corrections to stay accurate, built into the mathematical architecture of general relativity, as Einstein published it in 1915. Time is not a constant. It is a dimension that responds to two things, velocity and gravity. Move faster, and time runs slower relative to a stationary observer. Sit in a weaker gravitational field, and time runs faster relative to someone deeper in a well of gravity. The International Space Station moves at approximately 28,000 kilometers per hour. It also orbits at an altitude where Earth's gravitational pull is measurably weaker than at the surface. These two effects work in opposite directions on the astronaut's experience of time. The velocity effect and special relativity makes time aboard the station run slightly slower than on the ground. The gravitational effect and general relativity that makes time run slightly faster, they nearly cancel, but not quite. The gravitational effect is marginally stronger at ISS altitude. The net result is that astronauts on long missions age very slightly faster than they would have if they had stayed on the ground. The difference for a 6-month mission is roughly 0.007 seconds. That number is real. It has been measured. It is not a rounding error or a theoretical prediction awaiting confirmation. Atomic clocks flown in orbit return showing exactly the time dilation general relativity predicts. The universe does this. It is doing it right now to the crew aboard the station, and to every satellite in orbit, and to every object moving at significant velocity through a gravitational field that is not perfectly uniform. The body becomes, in this frame, a kind of clock. Not metaphorically. The biological processes running inside an astronaut, the firing of neurons, the beating of the heart, the progression of cell division, the accumulation of molecular damage that we call aging, are all physical processes occurring in time, and the time they occur in is the astronaut's local time, which is running at a rate that is not identical to the rate on the surface below, by 7 milliseconds over 6 months faster. I find I don't have anything to add to that. There is a version of this chapter that explains the mathematics, walks through the twin paradox, discusses clock synchronization, contextualizes the effect against the scale of a human life. That version would be longer. It would also be a different kind of engagement with the fact, an engagement that turns away from it slightly, that cushions it inside explanation. The fact does not need cushioning. An astronaut returns from 6 months aboard the International Space Station having aged, by the measure of physical time, 7/1000ths of a second more than the people who stayed behind. The universe is not indifferent to where you are inside it. It runs differently depending on your position and your speed, and the body, which did not consent to being a timepiece, which has no awareness of its own temporal rate, which continues its business of heartbeats and cell division and slow molecular change without any knowledge of relativity. The body is subject to this regardless. It always was. Even now, lying still inside a gravitational field at rest relative to the ground, time is running at a specific rate for you and at a slightly different rate for someone on a high floor of a tall building, and at a different rate again for a satellite passing overhead. The differences are small. They are not zero. The first thing is the weight of the head. Astronauts returning from long missions have described this. The sudden, specific heaviness of the skull on the neck, something they had not felt for 6 months, and which now arrives with a clarity that is almost shocking. Not painful, just present. The head, which weighs somewhere between 4 and 5 kilograms, which the neck muscles have been supporting every waking hour of every day before launch, which in microgravity required almost no support at all, and the head is heavy again. The neck knows it immediately. The body, which had quietly unlearned the effort of holding itself upright, is being asked to remember. This is what return looks like from the inside. Not triumph, not relief exactly, though relief is present. Mostly just the sudden, detailed reacquaintance with weight, with the specific pressure of a planet that has been waiting indifferently for the body to come back and negotiate with it again. They cannot walk without assistance. Not right away. The astronaut who has spent 6 months in orbit is carried or supported from the capsule, lowered into a reclining chair, assessed by a medical team while still on the step or in the desert where the vehicle landed. The cardiovascular system, which shed fluid in the first weeks of microgravity but because there seemed to be too much of it, now cannot move enough blood upward against gravity. Standing produces a drop in blood pressure that the body cannot immediately compensate for, a condition called orthostatic intolerance, which produces lightheadedness, sometimes fainting, a feeling that the body is tilting away from itself. The heart, which adapted to the fluid redistribution of space, has to relearn the demands of a gravitational column. It takes days, sometimes weeks. The bones are not acutely painful. They do not announce themselves the way a fracture would. But they are less dense than they were at launch, particularly in the load-bearing regions, the lumbar spine, the hip, the femur, and the returning astronaut must be careful in those first weeks, because the skeleton that looks intact on the outside is not quite the same skeleton that departed. It is taking on load again. The osteoblasts are responding. But bone remodels slowly, far more slowly than the muscle loss and fluid changes that happen in weeks. Full bone recovery in some cases takes years, and in some cases the density does not fully return. The vestibular system is renegotiating again. The brain, which spent 6 months learning to discount the inner ear and trust the eyes, now receives vestibular signals that are suddenly accurate, and does not immediately know that they are accurate. Returning astronauts describe the floor seeming to tilt, walls shifting, the particular vertigo of a system coming back online in a body that learned to work around it. Some take weeks to feel stable on their feet. Some describe a persistent strangeness in the first days. The sense that the body is where it is, but not quite settled into being there. The immune system, meanwhile, is recalibrating against a more familiar background. The viral shedding that increased in orbit begins to decrease. T-cell responsiveness improves. The circadian clock, given consistent light and darkness again, starts to find its footing. Melatonin rising when it should, cortisol sharpening back into its morning peak, the body reassembling the temporal architecture that 16 sunrises per day had dismantled. This happens faster than the bones, faster than the cardiovascular recovery. Sleep improves within weeks for most returning crew members, which itself accelerates everything else, because the body does most of its rebuilding in sleep and had not been sleeping well for months. Rehabilitation is the wrong word, slightly. It implies repair, the fixing of something broken. What is actually happening is closer to relearning. The body knew how to do all of this. It knew how to hold the head up, how to pump blood upward, how to trust the inner ear, how to maintain bone density under load. It knew, and then it was in an environment where all of that knowing became unnecessary. and it adapted, because adaptation is what the body does, relentlessly, with or without instruction. And now the environment has changed again, and the body is adapting again, reaching back through 6 months of override for the version of itself that understood gravity. The retrieval is not instant. It is not clean, but it happens. Most astronauts walk unassisted within a few days. Most run within months. Most return to what looks from the outside like ordinary function, and what looks from the inside like something closer to hard-won reacquaintance. The body is not the same body that left. Not exactly. Some of the bone loss persists longer than expected. Some vestibular effects linger at a subclinical level that doesn't interfere with daily life but shows up on careful testing. The immune landscape has shifted in ways still being characterized. The body came back. It is coming back. The process doesn't end on landing day. There is something in this. In the fact that 6 months away from a planet can require months of return, that makes the depth of the connection legible. Not poetic connection. Physiological connection. The body was built here, built by here, more accurately, by the specific gravity and radiation level and light cycle of this particular world, over a span of time so long it resists imagination. Every system carries the assumptions of this place baked into its operating parameters. Leave for long enough and the body begins to forget those assumptions, come back and it spends months remembering them. Right now, somewhere, in a rehabilitation facility, in an ordinary apartment, in the careful daily routine of an astronaut several months post-landing, a body is relearning what you already know, how to stand, how to hold its own head up, how to feel the ground beneath it and know, without deciding to know, that this is down, that this is solid, that the planet is still here. It is a long way to go to learn something so plain, and the learning is still going on, in the dark, in the quiet parts of the body that work without witness, in the slow accumulation of density and fluid and circadian signal that will, over time, bring the body back to something close to what it was before it left. Sleep well,